Welcome to the Animal Liberation Hour, where we seek insight from animal rights and liberation activists around the world who inspire us to think, reflect, learn, and get active. I'm Michelle, and for this episode, I sat down with Lori Gruen. Lori and I discussed animals and ethics and how to translate that into effective activism. We covered a lot of relevant and inspiring topics, so you'll want to stay tuned to hear what she had to say. Before we get into the episode, I want to remind you that the Animal Liberation Hour is a project of Animal Activism Mentorship. AAM is a free multinational program that helps aspiring animal rights activists, as well as those who are already activists but want to take their activism to the next level. From one-on-one mentorship to free workshops and trainings to this podcast, AAM seeks to empower humans to fight for animals so we achieve animal liberation sooner. For more information, visit animalactivismmentorship.com and follow AAM on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship. You can keep up with the Animal Liberation Hour on AAM's social media too. Now, our guest, Lori Gruen, is a leading voice in the animal rights movement. She is a researcher, professor, and author. Lori is the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Science at Wesleyan University. She also coordinates Wesleyan Animal Studies. Her work lies at the intersection of ethical and political theory and practice, with a particular focus on issues impacting those overlooked in traditional ethical investigations, like women, people of color, incarcerated people, and non-human animals. She has authored several books, including the early classic, Animal Liberation, A Graphic Guide with Peter Singer, Ethics in Animals and Introduction, EcoFeminism, Feminist Intersections with the Animals and the Earth, Entangled Empathy, an Alternative Ethic for Our Relationship with Animals, and her latest book, Animal Crisis, co-authored with Alice Crary. I hope you are as inspired by Lori as I am. Enjoy. I'm here with Lori. Welcome, Lori. And to start off, thank you for your many years of prolific work on animal ethics. Your research and education have significantly impacted the lives of humans and animals, and you are really a bold and refreshing voice that personally gives me hope. So thanks for joining me on the Animal Liberation Hour.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So much of your work focuses broadly on how and why animals are less valued than humans, the effects of speciesism, etc., in that animals are mainly valued for their usefulness and therefore exploited in countless ways. And I agree that empathy is the path to respecting animals by viewing life through their eyes and their experiences. And my takeaway from your work in general is that we must develop our empathy in order to improve life for animals.
Yeah.
And that we've forgotten that we are in relationship with animals right now, all the time, and we can never turn that off. So let's explore that relationship. Define empathy, if you would, in your words and view. As humans, are we born with empathy? And how did we get here? Where
Right.
it seems most people have lost their natural empathy, or they're disconnected or cut off or obscured from their natural inklings toward empathy.
Yeah, I think so. I want to say a couple of things about empathy. There is a very popular view of empathy, and that view is one that sort of thinks about what it's like to be in the other's shoes. And I always joke that animals don't wear shoes, so we're already at one remove from that. Um, I have a view that I call entangled empathy that is a much more robust kind of empathy. But I want to before I talk about entangled empathy, let me just say a few words about what you were asking in terms of if empathy is natural and how does it get cut off. I do think that I wouldn't call it naturally, but I think we are social beings. If you want to say we're naturally social beings, okay, that's okay. But my sense is that we are social beings. And like any other social being, we develop at an early age, not at birth, but at an early age, a recognition of the fact that we're in connection to others. And we tend to, as social beings, care about what others think of us and what others may be thinking themselves once we can make that move. And so I think what happens early on is that children really do love animals. They love animals. They see themselves as in relationship to animals, and they're taught not to, or they're taught to love some and hate others and eat others, famously put, right? And so part of what happens in a society like ours is that what I would call the roots of empathy get cut. And that is, I think, a real tragedy. And it's playing out socially all across the country. So it's not just between humans and animals, but it's between humans and humans as well. Empathy is really in short supply. And there are moments in which it's greater or lesser, but at the moment, that being cut off from others is a very big part of our global way of seeing things. My view about entangled empathy is very specific. It's really about developing a set of skills, honing a set of skills that helps us to recognize, like you said, these relationships that we're in all over the place already. We don't have to make these relationships. We're in relationships. We're in a really bad set of relationships with animals that are used for food. But we're also in a really bad set of relationships with animals like orangutans that are being killed for palm oil that's in our food, right? So we're in sort of bad relationships, poisoning the air and the water and killing birds and killing fish and other aquatic beings. And anyway, so we're in all sorts of really bad relationships. And I think it's really important to think about how we can make those relationships better. And part of the way I argue that we should make relationships better is through what I call entangled empathy. Entangled empathy is a process that involves both our cognitive, rational capacities, our ability to think about what's going on for these other animals, and also our emotions, getting more in touch with our ability to feel with other animals. And so the combination of our thinking and feeling with other animals designed to promote their flourishing and their well-being is what I think entangled empathy is. It starts by recognizing these relationships. I think very much that no one would admit to wanting to be in a bad relationship. This is an assumption I make, but I don't think anybody's like, yep, it's a bad relationship and I'm sticking with the bad relationship. Most people, when they're made aware that they're in bad relationships, want to make them better. Nobody really wants to say, oh, yep, it's a bad relationship and that's just how it is. I think people will try to work to make them better. And so recognizing we're in these bad relationships with animals can help us to recognize the other things that we need to do to make those relationships better. I think that works a lot better than, for example, sort of arguing in abstract ways about why we should care about animals. I think it's really that we're in these relationships and we want to make our relationships as good as we can. And empathy will help us to do that.
I love how you frame it in that term, in that way, in terms of relationships, because it makes it feel more personal and more intimate. And we, we tend to be very motivated to improve our personal relationships with friends and family and coworkers, but we don't think bigger picture that we're all in somewhere. The threads are connecting all of us in that entanglement, in that enmeshment. Um, and so what I do affects you, even if you live far away, and it affects animals. We're like moving as one mind and one organism. Um, I really like when you're framing it that way. And here we do sit in this a relationship crisis. That's what's happening. It's a crisis, and all really healthy relationships are founded upon empathy and trust and safety. Same thing with our relationship with animals and with the world at large. So let's turn a little bit to putting sort of this feminist lens and this ecofeminism. Um,
Right?
in your book of that title, you explore the ways in which both women and animals and nature are dominated and oppressed. So we need to adjust our worldview to address the interdependent connection that we were just talking about. Would you please define ecofeminism in your words and tell us why viewing animals from an ecofeminist lens is crucial for treating animals ethically?
Good. That's such a great, important turn. And I think my view about entangled empathy actually grows out of my ecofeminism. So I think it's really important to articulate that at the core of ecofeminism is analysis of the ways in which there's all of these forces. There are patriarchal economic forces, there are linguistic forces, there are conceptual forces, there are important historical trends that lead us to separate women from men and nature from culture and humans from animals and good from bad. And so, and I think that what ecofeminists have identified and suggested is that binary way of thinking, that dualistic way of thinking, is in many ways at the root of systems that lead to the elevation and valuation of some over others. So ecofeminists are very critical of those sorts of what some call value dualisms, or basically just think of it as like an oppositional view. Like you have historically men are elevated and women support them, or humans are elevated and animals are used to support humans. So means to a human ends. And so what ecofeminists have argued is that we need to see not just that way of conceptualizing these hierarchical valuations needs to change, but also, and this is important because it connects all these things together, is that when we recognize that there's this move to separate, you've always heard this phrase divide and conquer. And that is, I think, one of the ways of understanding what ecofeminists are opposed to. Ecofeminists want us to recognize that when we start separating all of these things out, those that remain at the top or those that remain in power can like watch as those that aren't in power and are not valued sort of try to divide things up, right? So we're talking as ecofeminists about starting to recognize these interconnections, what I call entanglements, and seeing the ways that way of thinking, of divide and conquer, or that way of thinking where some are at the top and some have to be below, is not just shapes our culture and our society, and has done historically, but also perpetuates the ongoing devaluation, exploitation, and oppression, not just of women, people of color, but animals and the rest of the natural world. So these hierarchies kind of reinforce each other. I've often said this, and I think it's really sort of hard to explain it sometimes, but I say this thing where people say, "Oh, I don't want to be treated like an animal. Don't treat me like an animal." Or to be treated like an animal is to be exploited, work too hard, or that sort of, or kept separate. And I always say that if we didn't treat animals like animals, we wouldn't have the justification for treating some humans, quote unquote, like animals. So the fact that we devalue animals, the fact that they're lower on the hierarchy, is in some way an excuse or a permission to bring other humans down. Once we start seeing that the conceptual connection between that way of pushing people down is based on the fact that animals are on the bottom. If we were to elevate animals, we would elevate people, and a lot of the oppressive structures that exist would be challenged.
Wow, I love that. And yeah, it is so normalized. It's so normalized, this hierarchy making a verb out of it, and words are so important. What we call things, what we call others, the othering of others,
Mhm.
but the words are just reflective of this larger belief system, this larger paradigm. But yeah, I mean, to do what we can't do away with labeling altogether, or but there's some balance. There certainly is some balance to strike. So the commodification of women and animals is such an invisible, just like carnism, like Melanie Joy says, carnism is this invisible belief system.
Right.
So
It's an
commod-
ideology. It's an
it's
ideology.
an ideology. Thank you for,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
for
It's
saying
an
it that way.
Yeah, it's an ideology that we really need to unpack, because once we start to unpack it, we can get a better, it's invisible in part because it's designed to be hidden. But once we start to look and see, we can then recognize, oh, wait, here's how this is operating linguistically, like you say. This is how it's operating economically, socially, politically, historically. And I think these are really important insights, that it's not just animals, it's animals authorized in a way. Our treatment of animals historically, our devaluation of animals historically, um, authorizes the kind of devaluation that we see so many other workers and prisoners um, and and women and people, who are others, as you were saying, end up occupying that position. And we really systematically, I think, need to change that. And we
Well,
can't change it without looking at that ideology, uncovering it, making it visible. And that's a first step. Obviously, that's not the whole thing we need to do, but it's a really important way of making profound structural changes.
yeah, we need action, but the first step, just like you're saying, is have a breakthrough, a shift in consciousness to raise our level of awareness, because otherwise folks are walking around blind and deaf and dumb to the normalization that we're talking to, and therefore they're so resistant to thinking differently, to changing the way they've always thought of things. So I mean, part of my mind goes to, is it even possible in terms of transforming our world? I guess, we're saying, if we each take personal responsibility for evolving, if we look in the mirror first and point the finger towards ourselves, how can I change? How can I do better, be better? Does that have the potential to eradicate animal exploitation? I know it's not an overnight light switch, turn on the light switch kind of thing, but what do you think?
Well, I think that obviously we need to, so there's a connection between what we do individually and these really powerful structures that none of us could actually do anything about, even if we, you know, stop using animals in horrible ways, work against sexism and racism and all of the other isms. That's not going to really change the systems that are really, really entrenched. And so my thinking here is that yes, of course we need to do it ourselves, but we also need to recognize what kind of influence, what kind of solidarity, what kinds of collective power we might be able to mount, right? And I think those are really fundamental. And I do think it's important. Um, I guess there's a different way of thinking here. You could think that there's a bunch of individuals that change and they come together as individuals to make change. That's one picture. My picture is a little different. My picture is like one individual makes change, but also in making that change recognizes, oh, hang on, this really changes my attitudes and views about these other things. And you come to work together with other people and groups and collectively you change. So it's not like a bunch of individuals that are just making these changes and sort of demanding everybody become like them, but rather to be much more reflective and engaged and recognize we're all stuck in a system that's terribly oppressive, exploitative, and harmful. And so let's be, I mean, my thinking is let's be more attuned to the kinds of ways in which these harms, these indignities, these ex- these acts of exploitation operate, and work to, as we were just saying, make them visible, and then come together to make them more and more visible and make structural change that way. Because individually, this is a real vexing problem amongst vegans, of course. It's like, well, I'm not eating any animals, and I haven't been eating animals for decades, but more people are eating animals than when I started being vegan. So am I they call, am I just having no effect at all? And the fact of the matter is that it is true that one person can't really change massive systems of animal agriculture or climate change. But when we start to first unpack the ideologies that are at stake, get other people to recognize connections that might exist between things they care about and animals, then we can start to really, I think, make a difference. I know a lot of people think that there are other ways of doing it, like just, making it so that you can't get any animal products or something. At my university, actually, this is one of the things that a group of students worked to try to make Vegan Tuesday, and that was fantastic, but everybody hated it who wasn't a vegan. And so as soon as those students graduated, it went away. So maybe you made a couple of vegans, but when you're talking about institutional eating, you need a much more systematic change. You can't just impose it and hope it sticks, because it didn't work, at least at my university, even though I know that Meatless Mondays are an important thing for raising consciousness, absolutely. But whether it's going to actually save animals is a question I always wonder about.
Yeah, because it's a symptom of something else. And if you don't go to the cause, if you don't go to the root cause of why in the first place folks eat meat and that's so normalized, then it's just gonna,
Exactly.
the weed is gonna grow back because you haven't pulled the root out. And I think that's why your books are so important, because you're getting the information and getting people to reflect upon this to change their mindsets first. And we do need a multi-pronged approach when it comes to, but I was wondering and thinking when you were speaking, if I'm understanding, do you think we need what we call like that critical mass? Is that what will help to actually get laws changed in terms of animals? Is it but they also say that social justice movements historically have picked up momentum with just small organized groups. So I don't know if that's off topic for you, but what do you think?
Right. I mean, it's not off topic. It's a really hard question to think about what will work in making real change. It's a very difficult question. My work as a activist scholar tends to be a little bit more sort of idea based, as we've been talking about. But I do think that when you do have enough of a conversation, enough, as you said, multi-pronged approach, when you have people working and thinking about animals in workplaces, in schools, in media, in politics, when we're in all of these areas, and importantly, when people who care about animals are working with other social justice organizations, showing those connections, then the whole movement in favor of shifting our systems and shifting our structures, I think gets more force. Um, and certainly changing laws, it depends on the law, of course, but that can help, because it can raise awareness in ways that sometimes you can't. But also, changing something as simple as changing the way that animals are portrayed in the media. That's an important way of changing ideas as well. Helping people understand the connections, which many of us are doing all the time, but trying to understand the connections between animal agriculture as this massive industry that is a monopoly, and climate change and pollution and harm to humans who live around, factory farms. So I think all of this is a way of trying to get connected to the the variety of, um, I want to say letdowns or disappointments, but it's worse than that. It's like the harms and the violence. Let's go full on the violence that these systems are producing. And I think we do need to work together beyond, just arguing for veganism, which I'm in favor of. But I think if we really want to make changes, we need to recognize that there are these systems that are interconnected and they're working together to hold the status quo in place. And we need to start plucking away at that. There's a wonderful feminist philosopher who wrote about oppression and used the example of a bird cage. And I think it's a great example because what she says, this is Marilyn Fry, and she's talking about what oppression is, and oppression is to hold back, to hold down, like we were talking about at the beginning, to hold in a lower position, to keep under one's control. In order to do that, there has to be many wires on the bird cage. It can't simply be just one wire because you could just fly around it. And so what's going on when you're in a bird cage is that, or when a bird is in a bird cage, is there's really multiple obstacles that make it impossible to get out. So what we need to do as activists and as thinkers is to identify the various forces that are those parts of the cage, those bars in the cage, and try to figure out ways of undoing them, of loosening them or getting rid of them so that the bird can fly free and we can get more freedom for all of the people and animal people who are oppressed.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy. I love that. So, and really, you talk a lot more about this in your book, Animal Crisis, sort of, right? So we can unpack that a little bit further. So in your book, Animal Crisis, you and Alice Crary, who you can tell us about her if you'd like,
Yeah. Yes.
say we are at a crisis point. That's what we want to stress with people. Like, in the meantime, while we're being sort of quiet vegans, sometimes quiet activists. In the meantime, animals are suffering, and we're destroying the planet as well. And you assert that we simply must reorganize our ways of being in the world in order for all humans and animals to flourish. Instead, we're currently failing animals. And I know because as an activist, I do some of the activism that is going to vigils. So I see them in the trucks right before slaughter, or and watch the documentaries, and as hard as all of that is, it reminds us that it's a friggin' urgent for them. It's
Mhm.
too real. It's in their face. So tell us why, from your books and your view, it's so urgent, and what are the worst and best case scenarios in terms of our futures if we don't?
Yeah. So let me just tell you a little bit about the book as you invited me to do. Alice Crary is also a philosopher and has been involved in thinking about both human and animal exploitation, oppression, and violence against humans and animals for a long time. And she and I got together to write this book because we were really, really worked up about how much of a crisis we were in, and thought that people hadn't really been attending to that. So one of the things that we do, as we already mentioned earlier, is try to make some of these structures and ideology more visible and urge that one really important way for us to begin to make systemic and structural change is to pay attention to these overlapping and reinforcing systems that are causing so much harm to outgroups of all sorts, animals and people with disabilities and people of color and anybody who's on the outside of things. And um, there's so part of what we're doing is the kind of ideology critique that is so central that we were talking about a moment ago. And I think that is a really important step. But this second step, though, is to show the ways that um, our activism has to connect with other questions and issues. So we use case studies at the beginning of each chapter to try to tie the ideas together with the problems, with orangutans, with cows, with pigs. We talk about octopus, we talk about parrots, and we talk about ticks. Oh, rats. We talk about rats, and we talk about ticks and mosquitoes as well. And all of these animals provide us with and their plight, like what they're facing, um, is part of what helps us to think hard about the structures that are allowing for their plight to continue and how we might intervene. Now, we're not able to like provide a here's the answer to the problem, which would we love to do that? Yes, but do we have the skill? No. The problems are so complicated. But what we're looking to do is talk about how we could start to see things differently and recognize that the crisis is really a very important crisis. The world that my students, certainly younger people, are going to be facing is going to be so profoundly different than the world that we're familiar with. And it's already happening. I mean, we see this with these really horrible storms. But here's a great example. There's these horrible storms, and you have to be in a very, very specific niche to know how animals are impacted so terribly by these storms as well. We need to make that much more a part of the story, right? And we're not yet doing it. It's like the climate crisis is causing property damage in Central Florida. Okay, but there are animals that are being really damaged. We know this by the warming oceans. We see this by the number of penguins and whales and other fish that are dying because of the heated up oceans. So we need to tie these two things, not just these two things, but also the way in which certain people are being vilified and otherwise harmed and marginalized. All of these forces of um, disregard and indignity and exploitation and, to some extent, violence um, really need to be recognized as interconnected. So that's part of the crisis that we identify. Of course, both Alice and I have been concerned about the plight of animals for a really long time. So it is a central concern, but we're not able to provide all sorts of solutions. One thing that's really interesting to me, and it's something that I think is well worth developing further, and that is how to be in solidarity with other animals, how to pull these um, sort of groups of people who are interested in climate problems, other environmental problems, other social problems into solidarity with the plight of animals as well. And that's something I've been strongly encouraging, and we try to encourage in the book as well.
Yeah, I was thinking I wanted to add when you were talking about the storms, which we're relating to, climate crisis that we're in. There's also that there's no evacuation plan. We just had these hurricanes for and animals drown, captive animals also drown in, they're trapped within the metal warehouses in animal agriculture. And so that's also very sad and another thing we need to really look at as well. So I'm glad that this really leads into where I wanted to bring animals front and center. They're the folks that that we're talking about. I mean, we live lives of luxury compared to them, and as you say, they are agents of change and meaning in their own lives, independent of us, because we don't own them. They don't belong to us. They belong to themselves. They need to have bodily autonomy. They aren't just victims, as you say, in need of saving. So could you say a little bit about how animals communicate, how they're living their lives that maybe, again, we don't recognize, and how do we know what they're saying, even though they're not speaking in English words? And give us an example. I know you have many in your books. And how can we best convey that in our activism? Like, how
Yeah.
is there a way to bring that? Should we bring that front and center when we're trying to engage on the street or with friends and family, wherever? How do we, what would you say?
Well, I mean, the first place I go always is back to relationships. And I think one of the things that's so painful to me about our current situation with our sort of industrial treatment of animals is that we deny them the very possibility of having their relationships. It's so obvious in the case of dairy. And it's just so heartbreaking to think about, especially when or one knows, I know from Sanctuary how beautiful it is to see when mother cow is able to be with her offspring and they aren't ripped from her for human use of milk. And so, I mean, for me, it's such a powerful thing to watch the way in which a calf grows up to be this kind of confident cow and go through the world, whether male or female, just just having a whole different way of being in the world because they got to be with their mother. You know what I mean? It creates this really sort of interesting and beautiful sort of almost self-assuredness that moves forward. And we know that's true in humans too, right? We know that children who are, um, treated badly or abused end up struggling their whole life with, mental health issues. And so it's so wonderful to see the cows that are able to grow up with their mother at some of the sanctuaries that I've worked with. But anyway, back to the bad side of it, which is the relationships being ripped apart. It's not just in the case of um, it's not just in the case of cows, it's in the case of all animals, their relationships are ripped apart. I'm gonna say something a little bit controversial too here that, it also happens when we're talking about even animal rescues. So I, years ago, adopted a greyhound. He was a racing greyhound, and it was a rescue organization for greyhounds. And these 2 sisters were there who had all spent their life on the track. And I'm not making a negative comment about the people who adopted them, but it was just really poignant for me to watch these 2 sisters, one going one direction with this family and one going the other direction with this other family, and the dogs were looking at each other, and I just broke my heart, and I thought, "You know what? I've never really thought about the way that even when we're adopting, companion animals, we separate them from their families, we change their relationships." And I do think that animals are really, like us, are relational, and they're not just relational, but I should add, they're not just relational with others of their species. There are multi-species relationships as well. So these kinds of relationships are really vibrant and robust and should be honored and respected. And that basic level of relating is absolutely denied to animals in the agricultural food production. Um, and that is one of the things that I think is just really, really horrifying and needs to be talked about. In addition to, of course, how horrible they're treated and the suffering they experience and their early deaths and all of that. Yes, we always talk about those things. And I think those are absolutely things. But I also think that fundamentally, you can't have a system of animal agriculture that respect, even if you could imagine, which I don't think you can, but if you could imagine that you could make it somehow humane, I don't think that's possible. You can't leave animals with their relations, and that is a kind of violence that is just, for me, very tragic.
Oh my God. And you're right. It's so built in. We're so built in. And I think this will be a big aha moment for some people like, oh my God, I just never thought about how we are destroying relationships, animals' relationships to their family.
To their family. I know,
So
and
there. Yeah.
it's like they, I think that one of the things that we have to see is that they are, as you were saying, and I totally agree, they are valuable in themselves. Their own lives matter to them, but their lives matter to them in community. And so, right, and we deny them that community, packing chickens into sheds, taking broiler chicken, I mean, taking laying hens out of cages, it's still denying them their, I mean, chicken hens are really, I mean, we get the phrase mother hen for a reason. I mean, they are really interested in, they talk to their chicks and in their, as when they're in eggs, and they're really, they get broody. They're actually like the idea of having families, and they want their families, and that's just destroyed absolutely in animal agriculture. And so we should value animals for they value their own lives, but they also value their communities, and we're denying that as well. So I think that's an important part of the picture that often gets occluded, or it's invisible. In the movement, we've been for decades really focused on their suffering. And I think, and Alice agrees with this too. We talk about this at the first part of Animal Crisis. Their suffering matters. Of course it matters, but there's a lot more that matters. And so if we're really interested in liberation of animals, if we're really interested in freedom for animals, we need to start to recognize that they have all sorts of things that are denied them um, in captivity, in food industry, even in our, even companion animals. So I think it really requires this rethinking.
Yeah, it absolutely does. It makes me angry, like, when I think about it right now, or it, like, gets that fire going in us because it's like, how dare we? It makes me feel like, how dare we will be so, invasive,
It,
to animals, and it touches every animal. It touches all of us because really, when you think of it, and animals are so childlike, they're like perpetual children, and when we think of it that way, we're doing this to children. Like all animals start out life with trauma, with some trauma, and I'm a therapist, so I know I talk to adults of trauma. Later on, it's still affecting them. Never mind whenever it started, whether it was childhood or not, but all animals that are torn from their mothers as babies, and that doesn't go away and it stays with them. And I'm also thinking about being in sync with animals, like that as our goal. Like really the way for that is empathy, which for me is sometimes just quiet listening. Like
Mhm.
that's how I live with 3 companion dogs, and I have 4 companion bunnies and 2 companion guinea pigs, and I connect with them. It's not so much when I'm talking at them, I'm not really connecting with them and they react a certain way, but when I sit quietly and I just make eye contact, I'm very present, and then we have touch between us. We have physical contact. I can't explain the relationship I have with my dogs because it defies words. All I can say is like I listen with my heart, and I'm like 2 steps ahead of them. I know what they're feeling and thinking. And I feel like they the same way respond to me. Like they know exactly what I'm feeling the most. And well, how do you explain that? I know from a behavioral observing scientific, but also is there something energetic going on there? Something more metaphysical or deeper?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I do think that what you just said was so beautiful because one of the things that we tend not to do enough of. And this is part of what I think entangled empathy helps us to develop as like honing the skills of attentiveness and quietly listening and being present to the other. These are absolutely central to being able to understand um, not just where that other being is, but to be able to understand the relationship that we're in. So what you just described are really deep relationships that you have with your companion animals. And I love that you mentioned touch because one of the other things that we always get wrong because we're so visually and verbally oriented that's what we think, visual and verbal. But actually like we know dogs have a remarkable sense of smell. They actually communicate with each other. I mean, I actually, when I'm walking with my dogs, I'm like, oh, they're smelling pea mail. Oh, it's pea mail. That's they could smell another dog's pee, excuse me, and there's all sorts of messages and information and ideas in that. It's pea mail. And so um, the idea that they get all these some people when they're walking dogs don't even like actually they're not attending well enough to the dog to realize that wait, this dog is actually learning something about this other dog who was here some other time through that smelling process. And the other thing I think that you mentioned that's so important is touch. And touch is we rarely think about it. And it is so central. It's so central to all animals. I mean, I was just visiting Vine Sanctuary in Vermont and um, just watching, there's a beautiful cow named Rose, and she will clean the goats and the sheep and the goats are interacting. It's all through touch. They bump up against you. They want to be touched. They want to touch you. And touch is a really fundamental communicative practice. And as we know in animal industries, animals are kept separate from one another, or they're packed in so hard that the touch becomes meaningless, right? So I think this is one of the other areas that is really underexplored and needs to get sort of focused on where um, we don't necessarily have to relate to animals just through the kind of language that we use, but we can listen to the sounds they make, that we can read their body language. They can certainly read our body language. And so it's a different kind of communication that helps them understand us and us understand them a lot better. I'm thankful for so many um, people who are living with animals, of all sorts of animals, and even people who are at sanctuaries for, let's say, dangerous wild animals who are somehow in captivity here. For example, I've worked with a lot of chimpanzee sanctuaries, and I just admire and respect the folks who work day in and day out with those animals, and the way in which sort of the relationships of care that develop there, but the relationships of understanding, recognizing, and we get a whole other picture of what these animals are like, what their lives are like, what they care about when we're able to sit with them, when we're able to spend time with them, when we're able to sort of recognize what matters to them from their point of view. Um, and they communicate that to us when we listen, when we sit, when we observe, when we attend. We can understand. It's not that difficult to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, just swinging this back because this is giving people ideas for, kind, loving, nonverbal touch is vital for all of us, human and non-human animals, for thriving. And, it's my favorite topic talking about sanctuaries.
Mm.
I'm a regular volunteer at sanctuaries and have the greatest admiration for folks who choose that as their life path because it's a 24/7, don't never sleeps, operation to run even a micro sanctuary, as
Yep.
well as a larger sanctuary. And so, you're familiar and that these are safe havens, and that besides in the wild, they are the one and only places that allow us to get to know animals in their most relaxed and trusting state. They finally blossom, they finally unfold because they know the difference when they're safe and when they're not. And so, from a, how do we keep that in mind also when we're trying to be ethical and moral and more of a spiritual viewpoint of how we can approach animals as teachers and models and fully formed individuals?
Yeah, that is such a great question. Yeah, I think I mean I do think we learn most about other animals from the people who spend the most time with them, both in sanctuaries here, but also from folks who are doing sort of non-invasive observations of animals in the wild. I've learned a tremendous amount about chimpanzees, for example, from the people who've spent the time with them, both in sanctuary and in their range countries where they are dwindling but still exist. There's also sanctuaries in those countries that are trying to protect them and ultimately, hopefully, allow them a freer life outside of sanctuary. But in any event, the idea is that they are wonderful places to learn about the concerns that animals have themselves, but also to learn about what matters to them about their relationships. So, as I was saying about a cow who's just a wonderful, remarkable kind of aunt to all of these other animals who might come in different stages of duress, trauma, and what have you to the sanctuary to help them feel comfortable. There's just such great stories that we can um, learn so much from the other animals. There was a a cow. We write about this in Animal Crisis, but I also have had the great fortune of meeting her and spending time with her. Her name was Norma, and she was at a quote unquote humane dairy. I didn't, I don't think there is such a thing, but that it was definitely not an industrial dairy. So it was a small dairy. Let's put it that way. Let's not call it humane. Anyway, when one of the workers at the dairy tried to take her calf from her, she used her horns to protect her calf and harmed the human um, who was trying to take the calf. And the worker had to go to the hospital and get stitches, but the small farm wanted to kill Norma, but this person who worked there was like, "No, no, don't kill her, send her to sanctuary." And in the process, they wanted to save Nina, her daughter. And so they were able to. So Norma and Nina went to the sanctuary, and but they were really nervous when they got to the sanctuary. And the humans at the sanctuary couldn't communicate that you're safe now. It was the cows in the sanctuary who, embraced and, developed a circle around them, letting them know they're okay. It still took a bit, but it was the cows who welcomed this traumatized mother and her infant at the sanctuary. It was beautiful, and they're doing very, very well now. And there's stories like that that you hear about, and you just think, oh, it's so wonderful to see cows that are allowed to stay with their children, and to see other cows supporting and helping, providing, a sort of safety net initially, and then they become more and more confident as time goes on.
Oh my gosh, such a beautiful story. I'm tearing up hearing that because and it reminds us how and every sanctuary there's every animal has a story. Every animal in sanctuary has a story like that, but it just reminds us how animals have their own communal, tribal, spiritual life and emotional life. It's absolutely so true and us talking about that in ways that presents them again as these multidimensional emotional beings with their own needs and desires, as you write about in all of your books. Where do you sit with the importance of non-speciesist terminologies? How do you see that? How important is? I mean, obviously, our words are important, and we want to engage empathy in people. How important is it to catch ourselves and others when when speciesist terms come out of our mouths because this is how we're brainwashed with
Right.
these terms, and we can't help it, and I try to catch myself every time as much as I can.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important to both speak of other animals as beings with their own interests and hopes and desires and vulnerabilities and relationships, and to also make sure that we're sort of recognizing them as full people the way we would recognize each other as full people with all sorts of, that's one thing that's I think really hard to do linguistically, but really important to do. We end up talking about like species typical behavior. Well, actually, that's a little problematic. On the one hand, it could potentially be quite ableist. That is sort of suggesting that if you're denying the typical behavior of us that's normal, quote unquote, normal for the species, you're creating some sort of abnormality for those that don't fit into that. And I think that's something to really worry about in our speaking, because I was just talking about Norma and Nina, and we always have to talk. I mean, none of us are able to speak only about individuals all the time, but being a little more cautious about how we think about cows, for example, because, Rose is very different than Faith, who is, again, really different than Maddox. And I mean, so they have very different ideas. Same thing with chimpanzees, same thing with us. We're all different, right? We're similar, but we're all different. And so how do we speak in ways that don't make it seem like all cows are the same, or all chickens are the same, or all pigs are the same? I think that's a really important and very difficult task. Representing them as both unique individuals with their own personalities, their own very specific relationships with others, and at the same time identifying them as having a certain kind of shared way of being. It's tricky. It's very difficult to figure out the right way to do it. But I think it's absolutely important if we're going to change our understanding of and attitudes, and ultimately our relationships with other animals.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you keep mentioning the chimpanzees. I do want to ask you about your work because I'm just so fascinated by that. But before I ask you that, I wanted to ask you a little bit more around language, which is you talk about contextual moral veganism, which is
Mhm.
sort of a new term to me, but I get it. And in the movement, our vegan sort of community, there's a lot of black and white thinking in the vegan community. Like you're either completely vegan, which is good, or not vegan at all, which is bad, right? But explain a little bit about your view of contextual moral veganism. And is a vegan way of life possible given current limitations and complexity everywhere? Like, is it possible everywhere? I mean, the short answer is no, but
Right. Right. So I think that, it's such a great question. And one thing that it's a hard question too. I think there's an important distinction that we need to make between veganism as a lifestyle, quote unquote, or veganism as an aspiration. My colleague Bob Jones and I wrote a paper about this a while back. And the idea is that none of us really can be fully, purely vegan. And the idea of purity doesn't help anybody. So, we really can't. When I brought up palm oil earlier, it is nearly impossible to avoid palm oil. It is nearly impossible to avoid it. It appears almost everywhere. And I think you would have to probably be on a raw food diet to avoid palm oil. Palm oil is in so much, vegan food. It's in all food, but it's in vegan food especially. So, and palm oil isn't vegan. It's not vegan. It isn't made from animal products, but it is made from the mass displacement and slaughter of animals. So you can't think of it as being vegan in that way. And there are so many other ways that we aren't able to avoid animal p- parts of animals in various things that we consume or buy because of the system that's in place. So my view is that contextual moral veganism is one that suggests that we are able, we're like aspiring to be as close to a state where we're not directly or indirectly, this is the hard part, involved in harm to other animals. But as I say, it's important to recognize that that's easier for some of us who might be more privileged and more well off. It might be easier for certain people who have a certain kind of religious culture that makes, say, raw food or that kind of thing much more common and available. It may be easier for folks who are, in climates that where you can grow food all the time. But the other worry is that, if you think about being up in, you know, northern parts of the world in the northern territories or some places like that where it's pretty much winter most of the time, it's near impossible to be vegan. And it's not clear to me, given what we were talking about earlier, that sending tofu or sending, you know, vegan products in airplanes over it is going to be like minimize animal damage. So that's another thing about contextual moral veganism. I do think though that there's another way in which it's important not to say like, oh well, we do the best we can. That can't be the line either. We got to do a lot better than the quote unquote best we can in a way. We have to really work much harder. However, I also have this issue. I wonder what you think about this because there are some people who claim, I don't know what to make of it. I just want to leave it that that's what their claim is, that they have to use animal products for their health. They have health conditions that mean they have to use animal products. Now, if they minimize it, are they vegan? I mean, maybe so. Maybe if they speak out against the mass um, use of animals, but every now and again they have to use an animal product. It's really hard to know. There's always these exceptional cases that are just really difficult to figure out what to say. Um, I know a former student of mine wrote really hard. It was so hard for her when she had her child. He needed vitamin D, and the only vitamin D that was available came from lanolin. But she was a vegan, and she was in the situation where she had to figure out what to like, she had a newborn, and our system it's that problem. It's like we can't solve the problem ourselves. So have now there is actually vegan lanolin available in a lot of places, but it wasn't at the time. So what are you supposed to do? Well, of course, you have to do what you have to do. And we live in a system where our individual choices, um, we can't be pure in a system that's so impure that we live in. We need to do much, much better We need to change the system. But contextual moral veganism recognizes that. That's the idea. It's not saying you're a vegan when you are, free of using all animal products. Well, nobody is free, so nobody's a vegan. I don't think that's right. I think that we need to recognize that we are in a particular context in which we are doing our best and better than our best avoiding animal products and trying to get others to avoid animal products. Um, I think that's an important project. I think we ought to do that. Is that a vegan project? I think it is. It's a contextual moral vegan project. Yeah.
It is. The challenge of being vegan in a non-vegan world, which makes it impossible to be perfect. Not that perfect is the goal, but we're sort of set up to fail in some ways, and intent is also important.
It is.
So I don't know if there's an exact answer, right? Because so you're right. We have to keep aspiring and keep striving
Striving, exactly.
for
That's
an ethical world, that treats all beings as equals that way. So so let's talk about the chimpanzees, your friends, the chimpanzees. And I just have to smile when I think about them, although I get upset when I think about their plight, particularly, and other primates that you have documented and written about and spoken about so much. Um, the first 100 chimpanzees, you wrote about that first in the US, and now you have created an evolving website that documents the journey to sanctuary of the remaining chimpanzees in research labs, the last 1,000, and folks can visit last1000chimps.com.
It's last1000chimps.com, and then the first 100 chimps.wesleyan.edu is the first 100 chimps website. Yeah, there's a lot to say here, but happily, unbelievably, when I was first working with this topic, it was really heartbreaking. The sanctuary movement had just started for chimpanzees, and that was great. And that the chimpanzee sanctuary work was difficult, but there was still research being done in the US. And that research on chimpanzees ended. It was really great to be a part of the end of chimpanzee research. We were the only country left in the world that was doing research on chimpanzees. And so the last 1,000 website was started to really let me just say a minute first about the first 100 because it came about. I really thought it would be important. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Really important to identify these individual chimpanzees. What were they named? What were they like? What were their relationships with each other like? And so I documented that through a variety of research that I did over a number of years to try to identify them and indicate, try to, help people see them as individuals in relation to others. And so the last 1,000 site takes that up again. And I did research to try to find all of the names of all of the remaining 1,000 chimpanzees and where they were, how old they were, what their histories were. And when they could go to sanctuary, I would turn their name green in the website. And then that led to a series of problems because the laboratories, even though they stopped using chimpanzees for research, wanted to hold on to the chimps because they were wanting to get per diem money from the government. And so there's been an ongoing battle to get the chimps to sanctuary because some of the places, for reasons that they often would say had to do with the well-being of the chimps, but really questionable. I think especially at the former Alamogordo primate facility in New Mexico, it was really about the veterinarian in charge job, because if the chimps left, there wasn't anything else for him to do there. And so anyway, there was a battle. We thought maybe all of the chimps would end up in sanctuary. Some of them are still being held in kind of laboratory spaces. But the chimps that are in sanctuary are living really, really great lives for captivity, right? So captivity is not for chimps, not for parrots, not for wild animals at all. But these sanctuary spaces really do promote and protect these individuals and allow them the kind of freedom that you could only hope will make their lives meaningful, I think, and provide them with friends and relationships. At the beginning of Entangled Empathy, I write about my dear friend Emma, chimpanzee, who totally changed my life. And I, she's at a chimp sanctuary called Chimp Haven. And when she met her best friend Miff, um, who they introduced her to at the sanctuary, I, I just was so happy. I would go and she always want, when I would go to visit, she would want my attention. She would want to do this funny things she used to do. And I always felt like, oh, and then the one of the last times I visited, she had her best friend there. And she's like, oh yeah, hey, how you doing? Okay, I'm going to play with Miff. And I just was so happy. I mean, it hurt a tiny, tiny bit, and I'll confess, but I was really, really, really happy that she now had met and she wasn't so focused on humans, and that's what we want for all of the captive wild animals, that they be much more, some of the chimpanzees who spent such a long time in laboratories, they want to stay near cement because they don't know that the woods that they could climb trees in are like safe. So it is a process for these chimps, but they are living a really great life, particularly at Chimp Haven.
Thank you for guys, because I was going to ask you if you wanted to shout out to any of the chimpanzee sanctuaries, and hopefully folks can look them up and support them, right? I imagine they take donations and
Absolutely, and they need it because,
y-
having chimpanzees can live 50, 60 years, so it is, and they are, quote, unquote, "dangerous wild animals," so they need to be in very specialized, uh, in their facility, their enclosures have to be really, really well done. And then some of them, there's a wonderful, wonderful sanctuary as well called the Center for Great Apes, which is in Wachula, Florida, and they get hit by hurricanes now on a more regular basis. Fortunately, they are really prepared. They have indoor, night houses that are very well reinforced, and the care staff stay overnight. This most recent um, two hurricanes, there's damage that's done, but that the chimps and the orangutans there are safe. So it is an expensive project, but the reason that there are chimps and, in the case of Center for Great Apes, orangutans, the reason that they're chimps in sanctuary is because of us. We captured them in the wild, brought them over to serve our purposes, bred them often for various entertainment purposes or medical purposes or other purposes for us. And so we do owe them and their offspring as much as we can provide. I believe that.
oh, we have an absolute responsibility. It's our fault, therefore it's our responsibility to care for them. And I wish more people would think about that. So you said that the NIH stopped sponsoring research in 2015, which was the good news, but it's still allowed in private settings or academic settings or corporate settings, or not at no, not at
Yeah.
all.
So, no, chimp research has really ended. It's just that some of the facilities are holding the chimpanzees. They call it, quote unquote, retirement in place. I'm opposed to this. I think that in a laboratory environment, animals are fundamentally means to an end. That is the ideology in a laboratory. I'm not suggesting that all laboratories don't provide basic care. I'm not saying that, food, water, shelter, medical attention. Sure. But that's not a life for primates. It's not a life for anybody, just getting your food, water, shelter, and medical attention taken care of. You need to be treated as a dignified being. And that is not what they do in laboratories. So I don't think retirement in place is the right way for it to go. And they should be sent to sanctuary. Um, sure, and sanctuary, especially for chimpanzees, the transportation is, it's not easy, but nobody seemed to care about that when they were moving chimps from one laboratory to another. So why are they now saying it's too dangerous to transport them to a sanctuary?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, is there a call to action for that? Should we be protesting? But I mean, and chimpanzees and other primates are still in zoos, obviously.
Yeah.
No, and that's legal. And I imagine they're breeding them, right? I think they get very excited if they are able to breed any animal in a zoo. It's so awful.
Yeah, I'm actually working on a book on zoos at the moment, and
Oh,
so
good. Oh, good.
probably
Please.
not start talking about that at the end of our time, given I
Right, right. We have to wrap up soon.
that, right?
That's a whole other podcast we'll do.
Yes, yes, we'll do that later. That's great. Great.
Yeah, so can I ask you one more question? Then we'll
Okay,
wrap. Does
yep,
that sound
yep.
good? Because there's so much to cover, and it's all I'm so curious and individual, but people can absolutely check out your work and check out your books, and you can remind us how that can happen as well. But I just wanted to reference Animal Liberation, your book with Peter Singer, who you worked with on several projects, and Animal Liberation, a graphic guide. I think you published in 1987. I'm just curious how you relate now and how that book has stood the test of time. And, I know you said that his book inspired you to become a vegetarian. So any sense of what impact that book has had and your own books, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a really wonderfully interesting project. We worked with an illustrator, and it's pretty graphic. It's called a graphic story or something, and um, it is very accessible. One of the things that um, really concerns me is that it was in 1987, and our attitudes towards animals haven't really changed all that much. I wrote a book, in 2011 that I redid in 2021, which is called Ethics in Animals: An Introduction, in which I sort of really do lay out a lot of the different ways of thinking about these issues. And again, in that book, I do provide like stories about animals and their lives. And I do think that one of the things that's really important, as I said earlier, is that their suffering is on us, but also the idea that they're ours to treat as we choose is really, for me, the core of what we need to change. And I think Peter Singer has done an amazing job of helping to recognize that animals are their suffering matters, but it stops at their suffering, and we need to now move beyond the suffering and talk more about their relationships, their dignity, their their right to lead their own lives as their own lives, and our need to respect, admire, and learn from them. And that's, I think, something that moves us beyond that early book that I wrote, and the work of Singer, into my more later books, where I talk about these ideas more and how entangled empathy helps us to not just recognize their suffering, which is, as I'm saying, I'm not saying their suffering shouldn't be attended to. It absolutely should, but it's only one of many
Yeah.
things.
Should be a
Uh,
jumping point.
one of many things that we should be paying attention to make their whole experiences um, flourish, so that they have multiple experiences. I mean, some animals just think about this. There are many animals, including our companion animals, to return to that, who may be suffering, but actually are still enjoying their life. I mean, I know these are really hard questions to ask for those of us who've loved and lost um, people that we care so deeply about. But there is a way in which, and this is something that occurred to me when my most beloved dog, Maggie, um, was towards the end of her life. And she had renal failure. Um, she was suffering, not horrible suffering, but she was definitely suffering. I was suffering. But we also still had a lot of meaningful and important time together. So we had, obviously, there was a point when the suffering outweighs all the other stuff, and that's important to note too. But it would have been a shame to have just been paying attention to her suffering and my own suffering, um, and not also have paid attention to the joy and the care and the profound love that we brought to one another. So I think there's a lot more that goes on in our relationships, and a lot more that goes on for each of us, that moves us beyond just the issue of suffering or no suffering.
Yeah, relationships are so complex. Without exceptions, they're complex and beautiful and raw and challenging. So this has been a really enlightening conversation. Do you have any final words or any words of hope you'd like to leave us on?
Well, I do think that if we are able to think creatively and constructively about the connections between the sort of flawed thinking, if you will, about our relationships with others, that will hopefully put us into a place of more care and more compassion and more empathy. And we definitely need more of that all across the board.
We need empathy. Thank you so much, Lori. I really appreciate that. And we'll put in the show notes how folks can find you, support you, and how they can get your books. And I certainly urge people to do that. And I'm going to wrap up by saying it's been an honor and unique pleasure to speak with you. And thank you for taking time to chat with me here on the Animal Liberation Hour. And on behalf of animals and humans, thank you for your tireless, groundbreaking work. Truly.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Appreciate that.
Thank you all so much for listening. Please rate and review the podcast. It helps others find it more easily, and the more people that find it, the more people can be inspired by the guests interviewed on our show, and turn that into actionable change for the animals. If you enjoy the Animal Liberation Hour and would like to support our work at Animal Activism Mentorship, please consider joining our Patreon for as little as $2 a month if you're able to do so. This goes such a long way in helping us grow the animal rights movement through mentorship. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as everything AAM. One more reminder. You can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismmentorship.com. If you needed a sign that you should be an activist for the animals, this is it. Remember that it will take all of us to achieve animal liberation. Stay focused, stay positive, be effective, and keep doing your part. Until next time, this is AAM signing off.